correct me if I am saying this in a way that doesn't comport with what the research says, because I want people to hear what's empirically supported.
Mhm.
This is just a way I express it, so it's not something that's research-based. But people have asked me how important sex is to a relationship. I've always said, if you've got a good sexual relationship, it's about 10%. And if you don't, it's about 90%. And I say that because if you have a good sexual relationship, then you enjoy it, you're relaxed, you feel comfortable, accepted, secure, validated, desired, all the things that come along with that. And if you don't, then you feel rejection, you don't feel validated, you don't feel desired, and you can't get past that. And the reason I say it's 10% if you have it is because, okay, you've got it, now you can move on to everything else.
Mhm.
But if you don't have it, you can't get on to communication, you can't get on to shared experiences because you've got a chip on your shoulder all the time because you're feeling rejected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's one of these things about, what is a good sex life, and how do you and your partner get on the same page about it? And I think this is one of these things where we need to go into relationships realistically and saying, you can establish sexual compatibility up front, but that doesn't mean you're going to be compatible over the entire course of your lives. Things are going to change. Sexual desire discrepancies, where one partner wants more or different sex than the other, are the biggest reason people seek sex and relationship therapy. And it's because we encounter life stressors and hormonal changes over the course of time that affect our sexual desire. And so we have to understand that we need to continually check in with our partners over time to make sure we're getting those needs met. We also need to not make problematic comparisons to other people's sex lives, because I think a lot of people feel insufficient, like they're not having enough sex because they see people in the movies and TV, or they think their neighbors are doing it all the time. And when people get so obsessed on quantity of sex, that's where we start to see problems. Focus more on quality and making sure you're having the best sex, not the most sex.
Is there an average where people with anonymity tell the truth instead of being macho about it? Is there an average for different age groups or different lengths of marriage? And if so, what are they?
The sort of overall average is about once a week.
Uh-huh.
And there's some interesting research looking at how sexual frequency is related to our happiness. And what we see is that sex and happiness both increase up until once per week, but having sex more than once per week doesn't make people any happier.
Really?
And I think that's a really interesting and worthwhile point to kind of hammer home, that more sex won't necessarily make you happier. And, there's some books out there that challenge people to have sex every day. That's not necessarily a good way to go, because then sex starts to become this chore, something people feel like they have to do instead of something they want to do.
Yeah. I've had couples that are trying to have children. So they're having sex when she's ovulating based on her body temperature and stuff like that. And it becomes a chore. They really lose interest because it becomes a chore.
Right.
It's no longer spontaneous. It's no longer sexy, fun. It's a job. And sometimes they never recover from it because it loses all of its spontaneity and sizzle. But once a week, if they've been married 5 years, 10 years, 25 years,
yeah, so this definitely changes over time. What we see is that sexual frequency increases over the first year of a relationship, and then it tends to decrease after that. So in younger couples, you'll see sex more often than once a week. In older couples, it'll be less often. Less often doesn't necessarily mean they're less satisfied, though, because what makes sex satisfying changes as we age, and people place more emphasis on the connection with the partner, and it becomes less about the orgasm and physical gratification.
Realistically, what percentage of the time do men and women have orgasms?
So this is something called the orgasm gap, right? Because we know that men have orgasms on average more often than women. For men, it's in the 90-some percent, usually around 95% is the stat I see in most studies. For women, it depends on what kind of relationship it is. So if it's a marital relationship, I want to say it's in sort of the 2/3. About 66% of women report consistently having orgasms. If you're talking about in dating relationships or casual relationships, the numbers are even lower than that. So, for example, with a one-time hookup, the odds of a woman having an orgasm, for like a college age woman is about 1 in 3. So it's
Really?
much lower.
Is that because of anxiety?
I think there's this big part of partner specific learning. And so what we see is that the more sexual experience that a heterosexual woman has with a male partner, the more her odds of orgasm go up. Another part of it is that, sort of in the hookup culture, there's sort of this prioritization of male over female pleasure. And so when you get into a relationship where there's more equality, then there's more emphasis placed on female pleasure.
How important is it for partners to talk to each other about what they like and don't like, what works for them and doesn't work for them? That's probably a obvious question, and communication is always good. But sometimes I've encountered couples that have been together for 20 years and have never had a conversation about, I really don't like it when you do that, or I really like it when you do this. They've been together 20 years, so they've probably had sex at least 50 times a year. You're talking about a lot of encounters, and yet have never one time given each other any direction, suggestion, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a right way and a wrong way to do that where it doesn't come across as criticism? And how important is it?
It's very important. This is something I talk a lot about in the book. Is I find that the people who are communicating about their fantasies with their partners and those who are going the extra step and acting on their fantasies report the highest levels of sexual satisfaction, the highest relationship satisfaction, the fewest sexual difficulties and problems. On average, those people are thriving when they have that open communication. So it is really important. It doesn't mean that you have to act on every fantasy that you have. Right? That's a totally individual decision that's up to you and your partner and whether that's right for you. But for the couples where there is that communication, they're doing really well. And in terms of how you have that conversation, the framing issue is absolutely essential. You can't bring it up as criticism. And one of the things I talk about a lot is when you share fantasies with a partner, you want to validate your partner in the process. Talk about how your partner plays an integral role in your fantasies and how you find them very sexy and attractive to begin with. And, this is a way of just augmenting your sex life for both of you. It's not about you and it's not about replacing your partner. It's about having this shared experience together.
Yeah, I've got a book that's on the table when you go into our master suite, and the saying has probably been written on everything you write on. It says, love sees not with the eyes. I've had this theory, it's kind of like watching a puppy. You get a puppy and you don't notice it growing. Mm-hmm. And then somebody that hasn't seen it for 6 weeks comes in and says, my God, where did you get that monster? I've had this theory that when you're with someone every day, you don't notice them aging. Is that true?
Yeah, there is truth to that. And you also don't notice how their sexual needs and desires are changing either, because these are constantly evolving over the course of our lives. Something I looked at in the book is how our sexual fantasies change as we age. And what I see is that as people get older, especially as they enter their 40s and 50s, their fantasies become much more adventuresome than they were when they were in their 20s and earlier.
Really?
We tend to think of college students as, the hypersexual ones who are having all the threesomes and all, it's people in their 40s and 50s who are
really
the most adventuresome. And so for the couples who aren't checking in with each other, you might not realize how, sort of kinky your partner has become because you've never had those conversations.
You haven't asked.
No.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't want to delay the conversation forever.
Just in terms of age, how long do people stay sexually active in this day and time? 60s, 70s, 80s?
You see that in the data is that sexuality is lifelong. Yes, it decreases over time. People are less likely to have sex in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, but most people at midlife and in their 60s are still sexually active. It starts to drop off a bit more in 70s and beyond. But I think part of that is attributable to the fact that we just don't tend to see seniors as sexual beings. And
right.
that's a problem, right? Sexuality becomes this very stigmatized thing and no one wants to talk about it, but these sexual desires are still there. And I think we need to have a lot more discussions about senior sexuality.
I've read about this, and it's been a long time since I have. But the latency between sexual satisfaction for the male versus the female, it seems like the last time I looked at the research. For men, it was like 4 or 5 minutes, and for women, it was like 15 or 20, something like that. Does that still hold true?
Based on the most recent data I've seen, yes. They've done studies where they give men stopwatches,
Yeah.
ask them to record, from penetration to orgasm, how long that takes. On average, it's 5 minutes. For women, it's definitely in that sort of 15-minute mark. And so there's that big, sort of gap there. And we need to think about ways of how do we address that to ensure that everyone's getting their needs met.
Yeah. So suggestions.
Mhm.
I mean, how do you fill that gap? And do you fill the gap between him and her, or do you fill that gap before, ahead of time? I mean, I suppose that's where foreplay comes in. So you both get there at about the same time, or do you fill the gap between him and her? Is there a best way to do that? What's the research say?
So this is where it's going to take some experimentation on your part to figure out what works best for you and your partner. There's never a, sort of one size fits all answer. So one approach is to add more foreplay and incorporate more sexual activities into the mix. What we see is that the more different activities people engage in during a sexual encounter, the greater their odds of orgasm. So mixing it up, doing different things is really key. Also, not looking at the male orgasm as a sign that sex is over, right? There are still things you can do afterwards, other activities. You could incorporate or experiment with sex toys, all kinds of ways you could go to prolong the encounter beyond the male orgasm. And then there are also different sexual positions you can try. One that I talk about a lot on my blog is it's called the coital alignment technique. It's sort of a different way of having sex where the base of the male partner's penis stays in constant contact with the clitoris. And so what we see is that position increases the odds of simultaneous orgasm. And so if you can, sort of take that approach, then that works for some people.
Right. Survey-wise, what's the percentage of couples, or if it's different for men or women, that are comfortable with using like vibrators or other types of sex toys? Where's the breakdown in acceptability between men and women?
So it's interesting when you look at research from nationally representative samples, most men and women have tried sex toys before, but it's something that no one really talks about, right? It's something that in my book, I surveyed people about, fantasies about sex toys. Most people have had those at some point, and we see that most people are trying them at some point, but people aren't talking about it. So I think that there is the openness there, but you're not going to know it unless you're communicating with your partner.
Yeah. Are men threatened by the use of a vibrator or something like that?
Some are, and if they are, they shouldn't be, because you shouldn't be threatened that a piece of machinery is going to take your place. Sex is about so much more than just a mechanical act. It's the connection you have with your partner and all these other things that go into it that make it satisfying and in the relationship. You're not going to have a relationship with your sex toy.
Yeah, a vibrator can't keep your feet warm.
No.
At night. Can't snuggle up with a vibrator.
Nope.
No doubt about it.